The avoidance return follows a predictable psychological sequence that most people misunderstand completely, interpreting their reappearance as evidence of growth, change, or genuine recognition of what they lost, rather than recognizing it as a sophisticated attempt to restore their psychological equilibrium without addressing the fundamental attachment wounds that caused their departure in the first place. Understanding these 5 distinct stages becomes crucial for anyone who wants to avoid being manipulated back into the same dysfunctional patterns that characterize the original relationship. Most people make the fatal error of believing that the avoidance return represents authentic transformation when it actually represents crisis management. Their attempt to resolve the unexpected psychological discomfort created by losing someone who served essential functions in their emotional regulation system. The return isn't about love. It's about restoring their internal balance by regaining access to the external support system they took for granted until it was no longer available. The 5 stages reveal the avoidance psychological journey from panic about loss to strategic manipulation, designed to restore their comfortable position of receiving more than they give, caring less than they're cared for, and maintaining emotional distance while benefiting from emotional intimacy. Each stage serves specific defensive functions while appearing to demonstrate growth, change, or authentic desire for reconciliation. Stage 3 represents the critical juncture where most avoidants sabotage their own comeback attempts, unable to tolerate the sustained vulnerability that genuine reconciliation requires. This is where their attachment wounds reassert control over their behavior, where their defensive programming overrides their conscious desire to repair the relationship, where they reveal that their return was motivated by their own psychological needs rather than genuine appreciation for what they lost. Understanding these stages protects you from being drawn back into relationship dynamics that will inevitably recreate the same patterns of emotional withholding, strategic distance, and systematic undermining of intimacy that destroyed the connection originally. The avoidance return represents their attempt to get what they need without giving what you need, to restore their psychological comfort without addressing their psychological dysfunction. Each stage serves the avoidant's unconscious goal of restoring their sense of control and emotional security while minimizing the vulnerability required for genuine relationship repair. They want to undo the consequences of their emotional unavailability without addressing the attachment wounds that created such unavailability, to regain access to love without developing their capacity to provide love, to restore connection without risking the intimacy that genuine connection requires. Stage 1, the panic of unexpected loss. The first stage erupts when the avoidant realizes that their usual pattern of temporary withdrawal, followed by casual re-engagement, has been permanently disrupted by someone who has genuinely moved on rather than waiting patiently for their return. This panic represents their first encounter with real consequences for their emotional unavailability, forcing them to confront that their strategic distance has created actual distance rather than the artificial scarcity they intended to maintain for relationship control and emotional superiority over someone whose attachment they systematically exploited. This panic manifests as obsessive monitoring of their former partner's social media, desperate attempts to gather information about their emotional state and potential involvement with others, and frantic analysis of every interaction for signs that the door might still be open for reconciliation. The avoidant discovers they cannot simply return to business as usual because their former partner has closed the business entirely, leaving them scrambling to understand how their foolproof control strategy has backfired so catastrophically and completely. The panic intensifies when they realize their former partner's indifference is genuine rather than strategic, that the person who once organized their entire emotional world around securing the avoidant's attention has found sources of satisfaction that don't include them. This recognition triggers existential terror about their own replaceability and the finite nature of even the most patient love when consistently mishandled and undervalued through systematic emotional neglect and defensive relationship patterns. Understanding this panic reveals why the avoidant's initial attempts at re-engagement often feel desperate and chaotic rather than thoughtful and authentic. They're operating from crisis mode rather than genuine insight, trying to solve their psychological emergency rather than rebuild a relationship they systematically destroyed through months or years of emotional withholding and defensive patterns that prioritize their comfort over mutual satisfaction and genuine partnership development. The panic also includes the devastating recognition that they lack the emotional tools necessary to win back someone they've trained to expect disappointment, that their sophisticated manipulation tactics have no effect on someone who has developed immunity to their particular brand of emotional, intermittent reinforcement. They must learn entirely new relationship skills at precisely the moment when their attachment wounds make vulnerability feel most dangerous and threatening to their psychological survival. During this stage, the avoidant often becomes everything they previously scorned in their partner, desperately reaching out, analyzing every interaction for hidden meaning, and experiencing the powerless neediness they once viewed with contempt and superiority. The role reversal forces them to understand the emotional experience they inflicted on someone who loved them generously while receiving minimal reciprocity and systematic emotional withholding in return for their devoted investment. The panic becomes most acute when the avoidant realizes their former partner has begun dating someone else, when their theoretical replaceability becomes concrete reality, when they must confront evidence that someone else can provide the emotional presence and consistency they never offered. This competition triggers possessive instincts they never expressed during the relationship, revealing depths of attachment they concealed until it was too late to matter for relationship preservation. Most significantly, stage 1 panic operates through the avoidant's desperate need to restore their psychological equilibrium rather than genuine recognition of what they lost in their former partner. They need to resolve their internal crisis more than they need to repair the relationship, though they cannot distinguish between these motivations during their period of psychological emergency and existential threat to their self-concept as someone who doesn't need anyone while being needed by others. The panic stage typically includes frantic attempts to contact mutual friends for information, stalking behavior disguised as coincidental encounters, and desperate analysis of their former partner's every social media post for clues about their emotional state and availability for reconciliation. The avoidant becomes a detective investigating their own loss, searching for evidence that hope for reunion still exists despite overwhelming proof that their former partner has genuinely moved forward. The stage often reveals the avoidant's complete lack of experience with genuine loss, as their previous relationships typically ended on their terms or involved partners who continued pursuing them despite mistreatment. The unfamiliar experience of being the rejected party triggers psychological chaos they've never had to navigate, forcing them to confront emotions they've spent their adult life avoiding through sophisticated defensive strategies. The panic also exposes their profound dependency on external validation for psychological stability, revealing how much their self-worth depended on being wanted by someone whose care they consistently minimized and devalued. When that pursuit ends, they discover an emotional void that their independence was supposed to protect them from ever experiencing, forcing them to confront their own attachment needs at the worst possible moment. Understanding stage 1 panic explains why it often leads to embarrassing behavior that further validates their former partner's decision to maintain distance. Desperate messages, inappropriate gifts, manipulation attempts through mutual friends, and other actions that reveal their emotional immaturity and inability to handle rejection with grace. The panic serves as education in emotional consequences they've never had to face, while simultaneously demonstrating why they were incapable of healthy relationship dynamics in the first place. The panic stage concludes when the avoidant develops enough emotional regulation to formulate a strategy for managing their crisis, at which point they transition into stage 2, where their desperation transforms into calculated attempts to restore their position of power and control within the relationship dynamic that served their emotional needs, while consistently frustrating their partner's legitimate requirements for reciprocity and authentic intimacy. Stage 2, the strategic testing phase. Once the initial panic subsides enough for rational thought to reassert control over their behavior, the avoidant enters a calculated phase where they test their former partner's boundaries, emotional availability, and willingness to re-engage through carefully designed interactions that appear casual but actually serve strategic functions in their campaign to restore the relationship dynamic that favored their emotional limitations, while exploiting their partner's emotional generosity and seemingly unlimited capacity for patience and understanding. The testing begins with seemingly innocent contact, the casual text about something unrelated to their relationship, the accidental encounter at places their former partner frequents, the inquiry through mutual friends disguised as general interest rather than reconnaissance mission. These are designed to gauge whether their former partner has maintained the emotional walls necessary to protect themselves from renewed manipulation, or whether vulnerability remains that can be exploited to restore familiar patterns. Understanding this phase means recognizing that every interaction serves a strategic purpose to determine how much power they still hold over their former partner's emotional state, to assess whether absence has increased their value through scarcity or simply demonstrated their replaceability by someone more emotionally available, to discover whether their former partner will respond to minimal effort with disproportionate investment as they did throughout the original relationship, when hope still existed. The avoidant approaches this testing with the calculating mindset of a psychological strategist, analyzing their former partner's responses for signs of lingering attachment that can be leveraged into renewed relationship, while simultaneously maintaining their own emotional distance and protective barriers. They want to restore connection without risking the vulnerability that genuine reconciliation would require from someone with their profound attachment limitations and defensive programming. This phase often includes the avoidant's attempts to recreate the emotional intensity that characterized their relationship's early stages, strategically referencing shared memories, inside jokes, or meaningful experiences while conveniently ignoring the months or years of emotional neglect that followed their initial love bombing period. They become archaeologists of their own relationship, excavating evidence of love they systematically buried through defensive patterns and emotional unavailability. The testing also serves to determine whether their former partner has developed genuine indifference or is simply performing emotional distance as a protective strategy that might be overcome through persistence, charm, or strategic vulnerability. The avoidant needs to distinguish between authentic disengagement and defensive withdrawal before determining how much effort their comeback campaign will require and whether victory remains possible. Most manipulatively, stage 2 includes attempts to position themselves as having learned important lessons about relationships and personal growth during their absence, presenting their departure as a valuable educational experience rather than acknowledging it as defensive flight from intimacy that they're still fundamentally incapable of sustaining. They market their return as character development rather than admitting it represents psychological crisis management triggered by unexpected consequences. The strategic nature of this phase becomes evident through the avoidant's careful modulation of their emotional availability, providing just enough warmth to encourage response while maintaining sufficient distance to protect themselves from vulnerability, offering enough attention to reactivate their former partner's attachment system while withholding enough to maintain their position of emotional superiority and relationship control that serves their psychological needs. During the testing phase, the avoidant often employs sophisticated emotional intelligence to provide exactly what their former partner most wanted to see during the original relationship: acknowledgement of their feelings, appreciation for their patience, recognition of their worth, while carefully avoiding any commitments or promises that would create accountability for sustained behavioral change, rather than temporary performance designed to restore access. Understanding the testing phase reveals why many people get drawn back into relationships with avoidance during this period, mistaking strategic engagement for authentic change, calculated attention for genuine affection, and temporary vulnerability for sustainable emotional growth. The avoidant becomes skilled at providing just enough of what was missing from the original relationship to reactivate hope, while maintaining the fundamental patterns that made genuine intimacy impossible. The testing phase also includes sophisticated emotional manipulation, where the avoidant presents themselves as wounded by the breakup, confused by their former partner's unwillingness to give them another chance, and genuinely mystified by someone's inability to see their obvious growth and transformation. They position themselves as the victim of someone's unreasonable standards, rather than accepting responsibility for creating the very defensive behaviors their former partner learned to protect themselves from. Most significantly, Stage 2 reveals the avoidant's fundamental inability to understand that their former partner's protective boundaries represent healthy self-preservation rather than vindictive punishment. That indifference reflects genuine emotional healing rather than strategic manipulation, and that their reluctance to re-engage stems from hard-won wisdom rather than stubborn refusal to forgive someone who has learned important lessons about love and commitment. The testing phase concludes when the avoidant has gathered sufficient information about their former partner's emotional state and defensive capabilities to move into Stage 3, where they must decide whether to risk genuine vulnerability for authentic reconciliation or attempt to restore their previous relationship dynamic through psychological manipulation disguised as personal growth and romantic pursuit that serves their needs rather than creating mutual satisfaction. Stage 3. The vulnerability trap, where most fail. Stage 3 represents the critical juncture where the avoidant must choose between genuine vulnerability required for authentic reconciliation and their psychological safety system that has protected them from intimacy-related trauma throughout their adult life. This stage becomes the graveyard of most avoidant comeback attempts because it demands sustained emotional exposure that their attachment wounds interpret as existential threat, forcing them to choose between getting their partner back and maintaining the defensive structures that define their identity and sense of safety in a world they've learned to navigate through emotional distance and strategic relationship management. The vulnerability trap manifests when the avoidant realizes that their strategic testing has revealed their former partner's sophisticated defensive systems, emotional boundaries, and genuine indifference that cannot be overcome through manipulation, charm, or calculated emotional availability. Their former partner has developed immunity to their particular brand of intermittent reinforcement, forcing them to either provide consistent emotional presence or accept permanent loss of someone they've discovered they cannot replace with anyone who tolerates their emotional limitations. Understanding this trap means recognizing that it triggers every attachment wound. The avoidant possesses simultaneously the fear of being truly known and found inadequate, the terror of emotional dependency on someone who could abandon them, the panic about losing autonomy through genuine emotional investment, and the overwhelming anxiety about sustaining the kind of vulnerable presence that healthy relationships require from emotionally mature adults who can prioritize partnership over self-protection. Most avoidants fail at this stage because the sustained vulnerability required for authentic reconciliation feels more threatening than the loss of their most important relationship, forcing them to choose familiar psychological safety over unfamiliar emotional risk. Their nervous system interprets genuine intimacy as mortal danger that must be avoided regardless of the cost to their long-term happiness and relationship satisfaction. triggering fight or flight responses that make authentic emotional presence feel impossible to maintain. The trap becomes most evident when the avoidant attempts to provide the emotional availability their former partner always needed, but discovers they cannot maintain such presence without experiencing overwhelming anxiety about losing themselves, being consumed by another person's needs, or becoming vulnerable to the kind of devastating abandonment they experienced in their foundational relationships that created their defensive programming and attachment trauma. During this stage, the avoidant often sabotages their own comeback attempts through behaviors that reveal their unchanged emotional limitations, reverting to withdrawal when intimacy becomes too intense, creating conflict when connection feels too threatening, or demonstrating the same patterns of emotional unavailability that destroyed the relationship originally, while expecting different outcomes from identical behaviors that prioritize their comfort over mutual relationship success. The vulnerability trap also includes the avoidant's recognition that authentic reconciliation would require them to acknowledge the full extent of damage their emotional withholding created, to take responsibility for their role in destroying something valuable, and to commit to sustained behavior change rather than temporary performance designed to restore their psychological equilibrium without addressing underlying attachment dysfunction that makes genuine intimacy feel dangerous rather than healing. Most devastatingly, stage 3 often reveals that the avoidant's desire to return stems primarily from their own psychological needs rather than genuine appreciation for their former partner's worth and the value of mutual intimate connection. They want to resolve their internal crisis more than they want to rebuild a relationship for mutual benefit, though they cannot distinguish between these motivations during their period of vulnerability-induced panic and existential threat to their comfortable emotional equilibrium. The failure at stage 3 typically manifests through the avoidant's retreat into familiar defensive patterns, just as their former partner begins to soften and consider the possibility of reconciliation. This timing makes their failure particularly cruel because it occurs precisely when hope for authentic change seems most justified, leaving their former partner feeling manipulated and confirmed in their decision to maintain protective boundaries against someone who cannot sustain emotional growth under pressure. Understanding why most avoidants fail at stage 3 reveals that their comeback attempts represent sophisticated crisis management rather than authentic personal growth, temporary adaptation to loss rather than permanent transformation of attachment patterns, and strategic behavior designed to restore their comfort zone rather than genuine evolution toward emotional maturity and capacity for sustained intimacy that requires daily choice rather than periodic performance. The vulnerability trap becomes most insidious when the avoidant begins to experience genuine remorse for their behavior and authentic desire for change, but discovers that good intentions cannot overcome decades of defensive programming without sustained effort and professional support. They're unwilling to pursue. Their attachment wounds sabotage their conscious desire for reconciliation, creating internal conflict between what they want and what they can actually sustain. During stage 3, the avoidant often experiences their first genuine taste of what authentic vulnerability feels like. The terrifying exposure of needing someone more than they're needed, caring more than they're cared for, and risking everything for someone who has learned to live without them. This experience often triggers such overwhelming anxiety that they retreat into defensive strategies that provide immediate relief while destroying long-term relationship possibilities. Stage 4, the authentic pursuit. The rare avoidant who successfully navigates stage 3's vulnerability trap enters the authentic pursuit phase, where their behavior transforms from strategic manipulation designed to restore psychological equilibrium into genuine effort to rebuild a relationship they finally recognize as irreplaceable and worth the terrifying work of sustained emotional presence. This stage represents actual character development rather than sophisticated crisis management. though it remains fragile and can easily regress if the avoidant becomes overwhelmed by the sustained vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires from someone with their attachment limitations. Authentic pursuit manifests through the avoidant's willingness to do whatever their former partner requires for reconciliation, including therapy, accountability measures, and consistent demonstration of change over extended periods, rather than expecting immediate forgiveness based on promises or brief displays of growth. They accept that rebuilding trust requires time, patience, and sustained behavioral evidence rather than emotional declarations or strategic vulnerability performances designed to expedite reconciliation without doing the actual work of personal transformation. Understanding this stage means recognizing that authentic pursuit includes the avoidance acknowledgement of the full scope of damage their emotional withholding created, their genuine remorse for choosing psychological safety over their partner's emotional needs, and their commitment to developing the internal resources necessary for sustained intimacy rather than expecting their former partner to continue accepting minimal emotional investment while providing maximum emotional labor and relationship maintenance. The authenticity becomes evident through the avoidance willingness to tolerate their former partner's protective boundaries without attempting to manipulate those boundaries away, to accept consequences for their previous behavior without defensive justifications, and to invest consistent effort in rebuilding connection even when such effort produces no immediate rewards or positive responses from someone who has learned to protect themselves from future disappointment and emotional manipulation. During authentic pursuit, the avoidant demonstrates understanding that reconciliation serves their former partner's needs as much as their own, that rebuilding the relationship must create better outcomes for both people rather than simply restoring the previous dynamic where one person provided most of the emotional labor while the other maintained comfortable distance through sophisticated defensive strategies and systematic emotional withholding. This stage also includes the avoidant's recognition that their emotional limitations created genuine trauma in their former partner, that their defensive patterns produced real psychological damage in someone who loved them generously, and that healing such damage requires sustained emotional presence and consistency rather than periodic efforts when crisis threatens their psychological equilibrium or relationship security. They must accept responsibility for being the source of trauma rather than positioning themselves as fellow victims. Most significantly, stage 4 includes the avoidant's acceptance that they may never succeed in winning back their former partner despite their authentic efforts, that their genuine pursuit might serve primarily as their own healing journey rather than successful reconciliation campaign, and that personal growth must continue regardless of relationship outcomes rather than being contingent on external validation or successful manipulation of their former partner's boundaries. Stage 5. The integration challenge. The final stage presents the avoidant's ultimate test, integrating their newfound emotional availability into a sustainable relationship pattern that can withstand the inevitable challenges, conflicts, and mundane realities that characterize long-term partnerships without triggering regression to their familiar defensive strategies. Integration represents the difference between temporary behavioral change motivated by crisis and permanent transformation of attachment patterns that allows genuine intimacy to flourish, even when the initial urgency of reconciliation fades into routine daily life and ordinary relationship maintenance. Understanding stage 5 means recognizing that integration failure occurs when the avoidant assumes their successful reunion proves they've conquered their attachment issues, rather than acknowledging that rebuilding the relationship was only the beginning of their journey towards sustained emotional maturity and capacity for genuine partnership. Many avoidants mistake reconciliation for graduation rather than enrollment in advanced relationship education that requires daily practice and continuous growth. The integration challenge becomes most difficult when familiar stresses trigger the avoidant's old defensive patterns. Work pressure, family conflicts, health issues, or relationship disagreements that activate their nervous system, survival responses, and tempt them to retreat into emotional distance as their primary coping mechanism. These moments reveal whether their stage 4 growth represents genuine transformation or temporary adaptation that dissolves under pressure when their attachment wounds reassert control. During successful integration, the avoidant develops the ability to communicate about their emotional processes rather than simply acting them out through withdrawal, to request space when needed rather than taking it without explanation, and to maintain connection even during periods when intimacy feels overwhelming or threatening to their sense of individual identity and autonomy. They learn to negotiate their needs rather than simply imposing their limitations on someone else. The integration stage also requires the avoidant to accept that their partner may never fully trust their emotional availability, that protective boundaries developed during their absence may persist indefinitely, and that rebuilding complete intimacy takes years rather than months of consistent behavior. They must tolerate their former partner's ongoing weariness without interpreting such caution as rejection, punishment, or evidence that their efforts are insufficient or unappreciated. The integration success or failure ultimately determines whether the avoidance comeback represents genuine evolution towards secure attachment or sophisticated repetition of old patterns with improved presentation. Those who successfully integrate their growth create relationships characterized by mutual emotional generosity rather than one-sided accommodation of defensive limitations that prevent authentic intimacy and genuine partnership satisfaction for both people involved. During integration, the avoidant must also learn to tolerate their partner's own emotional needs, bad days, and requests for support without interpreting such needs as evidence that the relationship is becoming suffocating or that their partner is reverting to the neediness they once used to justify their emotional distance. They must provide emotional support consistently rather than strategically, generously rather than conditionally. Most challenging for the avoidant is learning to maintain their emotional availability during their partner's healing process from the trauma their original behavior created. They must support someone's recovery from wounds they inflicted without becoming defensive, impatient, or resentful about the ongoing impact of their past choices on someone who is working to trust them again, despite legitimate reasons for continued caution. Conclusion. The 5 stages reveal that most avoidants fail not because they cannot recognize what they've lost, but because they cannot sustain the vulnerability required to rebuild what they destroyed through their own defensive choices. Stage 3 becomes their breaking point because it demands the very emotional exposure their attachment wounds have trained them to avoid, forcing them to choose between familiar psychological safety and unfamiliar relationship healing that requires sustained courage and daily recommitment to growth. Understanding these stages protects you from being manipulated by impressive stage 1 panic, charmed by strategic stage 2 testing, or seduced by temporary stage 3 vulnerability that evaporates when the crisis passes and their defensive programming reasserts control over their behavior. Most avoidant comebacks represent psychological crisis management rather than authentic personal growth, temporary adaptation rather than permanent transformation of their capacity for genuine intimacy and sustained emotional availability. The tragic reality is that avoidants often possess the emotional capacity necessary for genuine change, but lack the courage to sustain vulnerability long enough for that capacity to develop into consistent behavior that can rebuild trust and create authentic intimacy. They can perform growth temporarily, but struggle to maintain it permanently, leaving their partners perpetually uncertain about whether this time will be different or simply another sophisticated repetition of familiar patterns disguised as personal evolution. Those rare avoidants who successfully complete all 5 stages discover that losing someone they loved was the catalyst necessary for developing the emotional courage they always possessed but never accessed until crisis forced them to choose between growth and permanent loss. Their journey from panic to integration represents one of the most difficult psychological transformations possible. Learning to choose love over safety, vulnerability over control, and authentic connection over defensive isolation that has protected them while preventing genuine happiness. The stages ultimately reveal that an avoidance return means nothing without sustained follow-through, that their recognition of loss carries no value without commitment to change, and that their desire for reunion must be matched by willingness to do the terrifying work of becoming someone capable of sustaining the very intimacy they've spent their adult life avoiding through sophisticated defensive strategies that protected them from vulnerability while ensuring they never experienced the authentic love and genuine partnership they actually crave but fear more than loneliness itself.